Okay, in this last video, we're going to look at um, one of the two men in the center of this very famous fresco by the Renaissance painter Raphael that he called the School of Athens. Now, this is an imaginary place that exists in the mind of the painter, but that he wanted to represent all of the greatest minds of Western history, in which he also included some of the great Arab thinkers like Averroes here on the left. You see Socrates, kind of the ugly snub-nosed Socrates, here talking to Alcibiades. And in the center, what Raphael considered to be the two most important figures in this great festival of human knowledge were Plato and Aristotle. And of course, these are men who knew each other very well, and who continue to be debated and read and thought of today. So let's tell you a little bit about Aristotle. Aristotle was not born in Athens. He was born in what we might consider to be a far distant province at the edge of the Greek world in a place called Stagira in the region known as Macedon, which would become very important in Greek history relatively soon after his birth in 384 BC. He's born just a couple of years after Plato um, founds the academy, and of course just about 15 years after the death of Socrates. So Aristotle didn't live through the Peloponnesian War, the great golden age of Athens. This is in the past when Aristotle is a child. He grows up in the court of the Macedonian king. Again, this is a kind of a provincial, not very rich or powerful place yet. And his father, Nicomachus, is a doctor. So Aristotle is trained first and foremost in medical science, in what we could call the natural sciences. You picture him as a kid running around and turning over rocks and looking at different bugs and drawing them, and looking at leaves and drawing them, and with his hands down in the dirt. That's how I picture Aristotle. As a teenager, he moves to Athens. His father sends him to Athens to study. Well, now there's a new place you can study. You can go there and study with a group of the greatest minds in Greece, this place called the Academy in Athens. And so Aristotle goes and quickly becomes Plato's one of his star students. Again, if you gave me a time machine and I couldn't go to see the debut of Aeschylus's Oresteia, I probably would go to Athens in about 360 BC and sit in on a dinner party conference between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle runs to succeed. When Plato dies in 347, an old and accomplished man, he runs for the first ever academic election. He loses this election to a nephew of Plato and decides to leave. Fine, I'm out of here. And this is where he does his travels and collects lots of research on the natural sciences and botany and astronomy and biology. He also takes a job for a few years as a tutor to the young prince of the court of Macedon, who you may have heard of because his name is also my name, Alexander. Alexander is a Greek name, Alexandros, which means the protector of man or mankind. And this is a young prince who is not maybe so interested in philosophy, but is very influenced by Aristotle and realizes that what Aristotle is teaching him is a very precious culture, very precious treasure, the treasure of philosophy and literature and poetry and history. And so Alexander would go on, of course, to conquer Egypt and Persia and as far east as India, and it would take these teachings of Aristotle, Greek culture, and bring them all over the known world. And thus we see in the conquest of Alexander the end of what we call the classical age and the beginning of what we call the Hellenistic age, meaning the Greekifying age. Hellenistic means Greek-like, where the Greek culture, which had been very marginal and very small in comparison to the older, more powerful Egyptians and Sumerians and Babylonians and Persians, now because of Alexander, this provincial, young prince, and his incredible success in his conquests, Greek culture can be found in temples and plays and art from what is now Pakistan to the mouth of the Nile in Egypt. And so this is the beginning of a new phase of ancient history. And following Alexander's departure from Greece and his conquest, Aristotle goes back to Athens and founds the second great university, called the Lyceum. So if you've heard the word lycée in French, it comes from Aristotle's school in the heart of Athens, which is, you can still go to the site today. And here Aristotle writes both dialogues, as Plato did, as well as treatises for his own students that were compilations, you could say, of his notes on all of these important topics of ethics and politics and rhetoric and literature and writings about the soul. And these are the only works that we have of Aristotle. All of his dialogues, we think around 80% of all the things that Aristotle wrote has been lost, was lost in the centuries after his death. Whereas, in comparison, we think that everything that Plato wrote, we still have, including some things that were attributed to him that we don't think he wrote. So Plato was immediately considered to be so precious and important that nothing could possibly be lost of Plato. Whereas Aristotle, his star dimmed several generations after his death, and many of his writings were lost. But once they were found again, they became in some ways equal, as you see Aristotle standing next to Plato in Raphael's painting. By the Renaissance, they were considered co-equal. And in fact, through the Middle Ages and in the Arab world, Aristotle was much more important, considered to be the number one philosopher of all time. And so his reputation came back. So how do you keep these two guys clear, Plato and Aristotle? Well, one clue comes from their hands in this painting and the two books they're carrying in their hands. So Plato's carrying his book, the Timeo, which is about the creation of the world. And Plato is pointing up to the heavens. He's considered, he's interested in otherworldly, eternal truths, not the poor copies of the material world, but in eternal truths like mathematical truths, geometric truths, the truths of Pythagoras. Plato is also a great storyteller, actually, in his dialogues, and he gets us excited and interested in his ideas through the form of the dialogue, in which, of course, Socrates, his great teacher, is the star. If Aristotle wrote dialogues, again, we know that he did, but we've lost them all. None of them are left to us. Instead, what Aristotle has done for Western knowledge is he is the greatest categorizer, systematizer, and fundamentally he's a guy with his hands in the dirt. He wants to explore how living things fit together, what they're made of, how they work, how they grow, how they succeed and fail. So he wrote passionately about animals, about trees, and also that the same categorizing ability he applied to logic. He basically invents the field of formal logic. And he applies that same systematic, step-by-step, inductive understanding of how to build knowledge to ethics and literature and politics. And so his work on politics, as we'll see, is really the first full work of political theory. Plato's dialogue, of course, is about politics, but it kind of explores in this meandering conversational way. Whereas Aristotle goes step by step in this logical treatise about what is the best way of organizing a city. And he connects this to a bigger question, which is how should we live? What is the highest good in life? And his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, again, his father was named Nicomachus, and his son was also named Nicomachus. So this book has earned the title Nicomachean Ethics because we think it was dedicated to his son. And he begins by saying, well, what do people say is the highest good in life? Well, some people say it's great to be rich. And then he says, well, is this really what is the best for us? Some people say it's great to be healthy, live a long, healthy life. Other people say it's great to be famous and have a really great reputation. And he goes through each of these and examines what might be right or wrong logically about each of these claims. And then he proposes his own theory after going through what do people say. He proposes that Every animal, every living thing has some set of natural capacities, has some kind of a blueprint that it's born with of what it could do at its best, right? That a seed of an oak tree has in it a little bit of a blueprint. He didn't use the word DNA because he didn't know about DNA yet, but he said that inherent in each living thing is that little map, that little blueprint for what it could grow into if it has the right conditions, if it gets the right kind of support. Its fullest potential, whether it's cows or fish or trees. Every living thing has some code in it that is its full potential. So if we want to see what the best life is, we have to look at what is that for human beings. What is this telos, what he calls the end point that would be our most complete use of our special capacities that humans have. Well, what do we have that other animals don't have, says Aristotle? We have a rational soul. And so that means that the best human life, right, what he calls eudaimonia, the best use of our daimon, our soul, is to use this capacity to reason, and not just use it to make money, but use it for the ends of good, of justice, and that this would be the surest way of living a good life, is making the fullest use of our active capacity to reason, and to use that reason for good, for public good, not to just help ourselves, but to help the city. So this ethics finishes with this kind of conclusion about the best kind of life, but he still has another question, which is how do we organize the city in order to make that kind of life possible for the most people? And so here he needs to do some research. And so unlike Plato, right, who points to the heavens and says, okay, let's think about what's eternally true, and think about the cave, and think about the bronze and silver and gold, and then deduce from this what would be the best way of organizing the city, using our minds and our creativity, our imagination. Aristotle says, no. Let's go out to as many places as we possibly can and collect data. Right? Aristotle was the first great systematic collector of data that we know of. And he goes and he sends his research assistants and his the equivalent of his PhD students at the Lyceum to more than 150 polis, 150 city-states around the Greek world, from Sicily to Macedonia to the Black Sea to North Africa, to gather information on how people in these cities organize themselves. Who has the power? How do they get that power? How long do they hold office? Do they hold it for life? Do they switch around? And then how does the system change over time? What was it like 100 years ago? How does it change to now? And therefore, what do we think might cause a city to change its system from one to another? Is it becoming rich? Is it losing a war? What causes political change over time? And from all of this data, he's trying to answer this one central question, which is what kind of politeia, we might use the word constitution, but constitution isn't really right. It doesn't describe the full range of the word politeia. Politeia means all of the public things, the whole system, the laws, the education system, the cultural system, the religious system. All of these relate to the governance of the city. So which one is best? Which one, based on all of this data, is the most stable, it serves the good life, right? This life of virtue and using the active reasoning part of our souls. And in this kind of project, Aristotle's project is responding to people who really hated politics. There were people at this time like Antiphon, who basically said that all politics is bad. Laws are repressive, that people should be able to be free and spontaneous, and that living in cities prevents us from doing that, prevents us from living good lives. And we see this in some of the works of anarchists later, and we're going to encounter some of these ideas. And we also read the historian James Scott. These people think basically states are scams. They oppress people, they control people, and so Antiphon was a contemporary of Socrates in the end of the 400s. Said, look, the best thing for humans is to get out of cities, get away from the laws. Most of the things which are considered legal and just are actually against nature. Law tells us what we should see and what we should not see, tells the ears what we should hear and not hear, tells the tongues what we should speak and not speak, and for the mind what it should desire and not desire. So this is a very interesting ancient idea against the state. And Aristotle takes a different point of view. He says, no, not all states are like that. Some states are very bad, but some states can be great. In fact, some states could help us. And in fact, we need, if maybe we don't need states, but we need communities, right? This is what Aristotle begins with. We're animals that everywhere you look, right? He's gathering data. Everywhere we look, we see people living in groups. What does that mean? It means that states can't be terrible if they're all over the place, right? So that we are the kind of animal that likes to live together. We're the zoon politikon, he says in Greek. We're the political animal, the animal that likes to live in the polis. This is Aristotle's argument. And that in fact, some might say that the family comes first, that before, we had cities, we had family. No, he says, no. The polis is prior to the household, the family, in the same way that the whole has to come before the part. And what do we also see? We see that those who don't have cities become mercenaries, become violent, become bandits, right? So cities actually help us protect each other and create order and stability and peace instead of random violence. And in fact, the city is what makes us different from other animals. And how do we know that we're different? What is it that allows us to live in a city? Well, it's our ability to speak, right? Honeybees live together. But honeybees don't make speeches to each other about what is right and wrong. That is a purely human thing. And that what makes the polis is when a group of people agree, have a common idea of what is right and wrong, what is good and bad. If they don't have that, then they're just a bunch of people. They're not a polis. But if they have that common idea of what is good and bad, then the life of the polis is possible. And what's amazing is that, of course, Aristotle was not an anthropologist. He didn't have access to the tools of modern anthropology or archaeology, but this is very similar to the idea from Christopher Boehm in his book Hierarchy in the Forest, which is that this was the beginning of politics, was using language, early human language, to make stories about right and wrong. So Aristotle may have been many hundred years ahead of the game in understanding the actual historical roots of human politics. So Aristotle loves his teacher. He moved to Athens to study with Plato, but he also wants to create his own perspective, and so he disagrees with Plato's view of politics. And so he says Socrates, and he means the character Socrates in Plato's Republic, assumes it's best for a city-state to be unified, to be as unified as possible. And he said, actually, my opinion is the more of a unity a city-state becomes, the less of a city-state it will be. Well, what do we mean by that? Because he just told us that having a similar idea, an agreement of right and wrong, is good. So yeah, he says, okay, we need to agree on what is right and wrong, but it doesn't mean that we all have to be the same. Right? Aristotle says, for a city-state naturally consists of a certain multitude, not only of a number of people who are all alike, but of people of different kinds. Because since a polis doesn't come from people who are all the same. And things from which a unity must come differ in kind. So you need to have some things that are agreed and some room to be different. And this is why reciprocal equality preserves city-states. What does that mean? It means that people have the ability to rule, but not all at the same time, that we reciprocate. I have power sometimes, and then you have power on other times. Now, it's not true in every city, from his research that he's done, that power rotates. In some cities, where it seems like there are people who would just naturally have much more knowledge, just like shoemakers and carpenters have special knowledge, well, then those people should always rule. So, and that may be the case, right, in some places. But in many places where that's not possible because people have the same natural abilities, and where it is the same for all to share the benefits or burdens of ruling, it is at least possible to approximate to this if those who have equal abilities take turns and then are similar when out of office. So Aristotle, one of his most controversial ideas, is that some people naturally have the ability to think and rule, but others don't. Others are natural slaves, he says. That some people are just naturally born to serve others and obey. He also thinks that women are naturally to serve men, because he's gathering data and he's looking around the world and he sees, well, everywhere that I can see, women are in positions of service to men. So that must mean that naturally, by nature, women are there to serve. And this, of course, is wrong. Aristotle was wrong about the capacities of women, but it was based on observation. And in the world he lived in, that was the case. He didn't have access to, Amazonian tribes or hunter-gatherers. He was looking at cities, and this is what he saw. So his mistakes are understandable, even if he came to the wrong answer. And I think Aristotle would be the first to correct his conclusions if he had access to the knowledge we have today. So he says, okay, what are the different ways? If we could cluster all of these different types of government from the 150 cities into a couple of categories, what would they be? Well, he says there are a couple of cities. There are some cities where just one person rules. Some cities, a second category, where a few people rule together in a group. And then some cities where a lot of people rule. And we can divide those three categories into two more categories. Where one person rules in the interests of everybody, we call that a monarchy. Where one person rules in his own interest, has all the power and rules to help him and his own family, we call that a tyranny. Where a few people have power and they rule in the benefit of everybody, we call that an aristocracy. Where a few people have power but they rule just to help them and their own families and friends, that's an oligarchy. Aristo means best, aristocracy, the rule of the best. Oligarchy means the rule of the oligos, a few. And then finally, where there are many people who rule in the interests, in this case the interests of the poor over the rich, right? He calls that a democracy. So he says that's a bad form of government because the poor oppress the rich. Whereas, if you have a system where many people rule, but they rule in the benefit of everybody, rich and poor alike, we call that a politeia. This is kind of confusing because he's used the word politeia in two totally different ways. He's used the word politeia earlier to talk about, political order in general, like the general way of ordering things. And then in later in the politics, he says, actually, no, what I mean by politeia is this is like the best form of government. And we could think of this maybe as like moderate democracy where the poor and the rich work together, right? Could we think of this as a kind of a model of collective intelligence? Let's keep going. So he uses this phrase once, harmonia politeia, a political order that is harmonious. And so he proposes something that's, again, new in political theory that Plato didn't say. Plato said we should have a city ruled by the philosopher kings. Aristotle says our city should be a blend, right? Some power should be given to a strong executive, a ruler. One person should have some powers if that person is strong and has great ability. Some power should go to a small group, right, that have the best talents. And then a multitude, the crowd, should have some power as well, as long as they're part of this agreement of right and wrong. But they shouldn't be poor. They should be neither poor nor rich, right? The men in the middle, that's what he says. And so if you have a system that balances the power of one and a few best talents and the many, especially if those people are not poor, if we can eliminate poverty and have a strong middle class, this is the best form of government. This is what Aristotle says. What do you guys think about that? But then you might ask, well, why would you include the crowd at all? Why not just have the very best rule? And here we get a totally new argument, at least from all the ancient works that we still remain to us. This passage in Book 3 of the Politics may be the very first passage to refer to collective intelligence directly. He says, in Greek, but the view that the multitude, rather than the few best people, should have authority would seem to be held. Some people have that view. And while it involves a problem, we can't just accept it at face value, maybe it involves some truth. The many, says Aristotle, who are not as individuals excellent men, nevertheless can, when they have come together, be better than the few best people, not individually, but collectively. And here he uses a metaphor. Just as feasts, banquets, parties, to which a lot of people contribute, are better than those provided at one person's expense. Politics, Book 3. For being many Each of them can have some part of virtue and practical wisdom. And when they come together, the multitude is like a single human being with many feet, hands, and senses, and so too for their character traits and wisdom. This is why the many are better judges of works of music and of the poets. Again, Aristotle is living in Athens. He's watching these festivals. He's seeing how people are coming together in juries, coming together to judge the great tragedies and comedies. And unlike Plato, he doesn't have the bitterness of having lived through a disastrous war and having seen his teacher killed by a democratic jury. And in Plato's case, Plato saw Socrates die that way, and Aristotle saw his teacher, Plato, live a long and happy life. So Aristotle doesn't have that same, he's skeptical of democracy because he's a philosopher and he thinks that philosophy should, people who are educated should have some special power, but he's not as angry at democracy as Plato is. He uses a different metaphor of the ship, just like Plato does in the Republic. Moreover, it might be held that election is the same way, since choosing correctly is also a task for experts. So why would you give the power of election to the masses when the masses don't have the knowledge needed to choose experts? So that you might say, okay, if you wanted to choose an expert mathematician or geometer, well, you would only let other mathematicians choose that person. And if you wanted to get a really good ship captain, you wouldn't ask random people, you would ask other captains who are the best captains. According to this argument, then, the multitude should not be given authority over the election or inspection of officials. But, he says again, perhaps not all these things are correctly stated, both because according to the earlier argument, the multitude might not want to just serve, be too servile, they might not just quietly obey, since each may be a worse judge than those who know, but a better or no worse one when they all come together. Individually, they might not have the knowledge, but collectively, if they pool everything they know, maybe they would be a better judge than a few experts alone. And finally, because there are some crafts in which the maker, those who are making the art, might not be the only or the best judge. The ones where those who do not possess the craft nevertheless have knowledge of its product. So people who are not ship's captains, but nevertheless know what it feels like to be on a well-governed ship. For example, the maker of a house is not the only one who has some knowledge about it. If you live in the house, you also know what a good house is and what a good architect needs to do. A captain, too, judges a rudder better than a carpenter, and a guest rather than a cook a feast. So the carpenter is the one building the ship's rudder, but a captain is the one using it. And so he doesn't have the expert in making wood, but he can judge good carpenters by the quality of what they make. And similarly, the guy eating the meal might be just as good a judge of a cook as a fellow cook. So I love the connection here to recent works in cognitive science, such as the works of Michael Tomasello, about the idea of combining our perspectives together in what he calls shared intentionality. And that, according to Tomasello in his research, the way that human collaboration works is through an inherent understanding that we're each partial. We have a partial view of the joint project, whether we're trying to cook a meal or build a house or run a school. That we can create, unlike other animals, we can create this idea of a joint goal. Let's make a school, let's make a house, and no other animal can do that. And that we learn to do that very young, from as early as 3, that we have joint projects and we can work on them together, and we understand that each of us has a role in making that thing, and that we need to combine our perspectives together. So this is something that now we have empirical proof is true, that Aristotle was maybe aware of in some way. So why does the crowd need to be different? And so Helene asks us to think about the analogy of the feast, that there are some people would think that, okay, well, the reason why this crowd makes a better feast, right, makes a better, that a banquet or festival is better when it's planned by a lot of people instead of planned by one person, is that they discuss, they decide, okay, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, and they make a plan together. That's better because they each have ideas and they pool them together. But there's another way of thinking about it, the counter way, the aggregative way, which is that actually the reason why it's better is that no one plans it. That if a large and diverse number of people show up, and each one of them, some people bring candles, and some people bring turkey, and some people bring vegetables, and some people bring sweets, and some people bring musical instruments, that this is how you get the best possible party, is just by letting people do what they do best without even needing to interact. So these are two different ways of thinking about the Aristotle's analogy. And there's some evidence for each point of view. There's this line in Book 3, taken individually, any one of these people, he's talking about people in the assembly, is perhaps not so good as the best person, but a city-state consists of many people. Again, he uses the feast analogy, like a feast to which many contribute, and is better than one that is a unity and simple. That's why a crowd can also judge many things better than any single individual. And because he's talking about the assembly here, right, where people are coming together and hear cases, deliberate, and decide, well, that would make us think that what creates the magic of collective intelligence is the interaction, is that people are interacting in this common space, and it's the quality of the interaction that creates the effect of collective intelligence. But then we also see, and it would be perhaps accounted strange if someone, when judging with one pair of eyes and one pair of ears and acting with one pair of feet and hands, could see better than many people with many pairs, since as these things stand, monarchs provide themselves with many eyes, ears, hands, and feet. Here he's saying that the reason why some monarchies work so well is that the kings aren't just deciding based on what they see themselves, but getting information through all of their spies and officials and governors, etc. So even though he's not talking about democracy here, he's making an argument for collective intelligence that is based on the ideas of large numbers of people, that many people observing things, aggregating them together, is what produces collective intelligence. So you're seeing both arguments for collective intelligence, one about deliberation and interaction, the other one about large numbers of people all seeing different things and aggregating it together. Then, of course, he admits, well, okay, but crowds aren't always wise. It's clear that some of them might not be wise, since the same argument would apply to beasts, and obviously we know that there are a lot of idiots out there. There's no difference between some people and beasts in real politics, but this is probably true of some multitudes that are well organized. So he doesn't have a full theory of how to organize the crowd, but he's getting to some of these ideas about diversity and large numbers and dispersed information, which become much later the basis for the science of collective intelligence. He also has a really kind of winking argument that, it's actually one good argument for including people is that if you exclude the majority of people, they get upset. To give them no share and not to allow them to participate would be cause for alarm. For a state in which a large number of people are excluded from office and are poor must of necessity be full of enemies. So this would be the pragmatic argument. Even if you didn't think the masses were so smart, if you exclude them from political office, that might make them upset. Some might say this is cynical. Some might say this is smart politics. What do you think? So the conclusion, what is the good life? So happiness, says Aristotle, is when we activate our virtue, not when we think about politics or think about the good life, but when we do something about it. But we need resources to do this. We can't not everyone has equal chance to act virtuously and rationally. We need a house, we need food, we need an education, we need friends. And when we come to making the city-state excellent, this is no longer a task for luck, but one of scientific knowledge and deliberate choice. A city-state is excellent because the citizens who participate in the politeia are excellent. So Plato made this distinction that a city is good when it's good as a whole, right? But that doesn't mean that every individual was good. It meant that it was well governed by the guardians, by those who had left the cave and gotten the right education. Well, Aristotle makes a different argument. He's saying, actually, we want to maximize the amount of people who are individually excellent, who are finding eudaimonia, who are making good use of their reason and virtue. And in our politeia, all of the citizens, in the best one, all the citizens will be able to do that. So how do we do that? Well, people become excellent because of three things: nature, habit, and reason. For some qualities are naturally, we're born with them, like, we're born being able to speak, but we don't have a language yet. People often act contrary to their habits and their nature because of reason. So sometimes we have biases. He doesn't say biases, but he's anticipating this, that sometimes our natural instincts aren't necessarily the best decision. And so we can reason. We can use what Kahneman would call our system 2, to counteract what our first judgment might be. And this is why we need education. Because some things we learn by habit, how to avoid, let's say, hot fire and poison. Others by learning, how to not stereotype or react emotionally to stress, these kind of things. And this is why the education system is part of the political system. Because each constitution, each kind of politeia, is based on a way of thinking, a way of solving problems, and that the way of thinking and solving problems creates a moral character, right? That the character, the quality of the state depends on the character and quality of the individual citizens, and this is why, because each individual needs the right education, the right support, the right resources. We shouldn't have poor people. We should have middle-class people. Those people should be educated. That the education system is properly considered part of the political system. And it must be one and the same for all, right? So part of Aristotle sounds very elitist, that some people are natural slaves, other people are natural leaders. But when he talks about education, the democratic side of Aristotle comes out. That education should be one and the same. It should be common. And remember, he was a founder of a school, like Plato was, like his teacher. He thinks that education should be general. It should be not just rich people in their houses getting sophists to come and tutor their sons, but public and universal. At the same time, one should not consider any citizen as belonging to himself alone, but as all belonging to the city-state, since each is a part of the city-state. And it's natural for the supervision of each part to look to the supervision of the whole. Meaning that if we make a public education system and make it available to everybody, that creates a responsibility. Everyone who gets educated has a responsibility to take care of the city, to act together to save the city and make sure the city lasts to the next generation. And he loves the Spartans because they pay the most attention to education, more so than the Athenians, in his opinion. So we've seen the sophists, Protagoras, and the myth of Epimetheus. Again, we don't have any of Protagoras' writings, but we have this story in Plato's dialogue that makes us think maybe he was the first to argue for something like collective intelligence through this myth of the politicae techne. We have Plato, maybe the most influential of all philosophers. His deductive method, his idea of the ideal republic or the ideal state polis that is ruled by philosopher kings, his deep skepticism of democracy, and his idea in the republic that collective happiness matters more than individual happiness. That the bronze people might be upset that they're not running the city, but it's the gold and the silver ones that should be in charge. And then we have Aristotle, who gathers data, uses logic, but uses logic on the basis of gathering data about the world, imagines a possible city based on this data where education is universal, where we develop expertise. He makes the first real clear arguments for collective intelligence, the idea of diversity, the idea of aggregating dispersed information, the idea of large groups being able, even with individual mistakes, that collectively they could be more intelligent. And so this is the end of our exploration. So we're going to discuss these texts together in person, and I hope you enjoy them.